Good morning. This hearing will come to order. I would like to welcome our task force members and the witnesses testifying before us today. This is the inaugural hearing of the Committee on Armed Services Future of Defense Task Force. I ask unanimous consent that non-task force members be allowed to participate in today's hearing after all task force members have had the opportunity to ask questions. Is there any objection? Without objection, the non-task force members will be recognized at the appropriate time for 5 minutes each. The United States faces a diverse, fast-changing range of national security threats, nearly unprecedented in their breadth and pace of change, and we need to understand them better. As we enter a new decade, it is time for a new generation of thinking about these challenges and how Congress and the country can meet and defeat them. Great power competition from Russia and China, which are rapidly advancing next-generation warfighting capabilities to leapfrog our legacy systems, is real. We have not seen a dual threat like this since the military surge of Germany and Japan in the 1930s. At the same time, the threat of transnational terrorism persists. Sun Tzu said, "The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting." In 1938, Mao Zedong wrote, "Whoever has an army has power, and that war decides everything." Over hundreds of years, both Sun Tzu and Mao's influence still guide Chinese policy. Currently, the People's Liberation Army is the largest military force in the world, and China is rapidly modernizing its arsenal while expanding its military footprint globally. Its ambitious soft power endeavor, the Belt and Road Initiative, has invested in the economic development of more than 100 countries and made inroads across Asia, Africa, and South America with major economic and infrastructure projects. In an attempt to recapture Soviet power and glory, Russia is increasingly aggressive in Europe, the Middle East, and the Arctic, and is ramping up its ability to challenge the United States and its security partners across multiple warfare platforms to include conventional and strategic weapons. Its well-known information exploitation and cyber attacks against U.S. civilian and military targets continue today. The return of nationalism in Europe threatens to weaken NATO and destabilize the European Union, and emboldened Iran is wreaking havoc in its neighborhood through overt military action and backdoor proxies alike. North Korea continues its march toward full nuclearization, and violent extremists and transnational criminal organizations continue to cause upheaval globally. For its part, the United States remains mired in divisive politics at home and conflict abroad, while our adversaries build and expand their war machines in ways that seemed unimaginable just a few short years ago. Warcraft of the future will increasingly rely on electronic sabotage, where adversaries seek to disrupt and disable our systems and networks before any fighting begins. As they once again demonstrated this weekend in the raid to kill Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, our warfighters and intelligence services are unrivaled in their skill and professionalism. But how do we ensure we're training and equipping them for success on the asymmetrical battlefields of the future? Each year, this committee passes a defense bill. It's hard and important work, but in terms of budgets and policy, it only takes us a few years forward. We need to ask, what should our fighting force look like in 2050 or even 2075? Our adversaries are asking themselves this question, and it's this committee's job to start asking that question too. Right now, our government and entrepreneurs within our country are developing sophisticated technologies, artificial intelligence, robotics, autonomous systems, 5G, quantum computing, and biotechnology all offer tremendous opportunity for social transformation, yet remain rife for nefarious exploitation. Our rivals will weaponize these systems. They've already started. In 2017, China announced, along with its plan to become a global superpower by 2050, its, quote, new generation artificial intelligence development plan, and set the ambitious goal of becoming the world's leading power on AI by 2030. The Chinese have been unequivocal in their intent to develop it for military use, and as we meet here, they're spending billions trying to figure out how. We cannot cede the advancement of these emerging capabilities to our rivals because the country that wins this race will write humanity's values. So we must lead in the technological breakthroughs that will define our time. Article 1 of the Constitution clearly delineates Congress's responsibility for our national security. We must work to ensure the Department of Defense is freed up to be more agile and focused on the needs of the future. Fundamentally, it is on our backs to ensure our young warfighters never enter a fair fight. Our task force mandate to review U.S. defense assets and capabilities and assess the state of the national security innovation base to meet emerging threats and ensure long-term strategic overmatch of global competitors demands asking tough questions of the Pentagon and of ourselves. We'll seek knowledge from long-standing experts, like those before us today, and from unlikely sources, and we'll build on the significant work that's been done by the subcommittees. We will look at ways to supercharge innovation, to improve the pipelines of ideas, technologies, and personnel into our military, and to make tough political decisions that guide the development of our force of the future. We look forward to providing the American people with our findings. I'd like to thank Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Thornberry for supporting the creation of this task force, and I want to recognize my fellow task force members who are joining me in this undertaking and thank them for their willingness to serve in this important endeavor. With that, I would like to turn to my co-chair, Congressman Jim Banks of Indiana.
Thank you, Seth. I would like to as well start by thanking Chairman Smith and Ranking Member Thornberry for establishing this bipartisan Future of Defense Task Force. We have been chartered to review U.S. defense capabilities and assess the state of the national security innovation base to meet emerging threats and the rise of global competitors. It is a vitally important task and one that I do not take lightly. I would also like to thank my co-chair, Congressman Moulton. I look forward to working with you and the other members of the task force. And welcome to our witnesses. I cannot think of two more qualified individuals to be here with us today as we kick off this task force. Thank you, Ms. Flournoy, and special thank you to Senator Talent, who I have the privilege of serving with on the Reagan Institute Task Force on Innovation and National Security. It's good to see both of you again. This task force's mandate underpins the foundations of our competitive advantage as a nation. How will we prioritize research and development, harness emerging technologies, sustain an innovation ecosystem, and rapidly field new capabilities to deliver them into the hands of our warfighters? The qualitative edge over our rivals is dwindling, and we can no longer afford to take for granted the military dominance that we have enjoyed. China's whole-of-strategy approach, amplified by double-digit annual growth in their research and development spending and frequent malfeasance, intellectual property theft, cyber intrusions, and espionage have propelled their defense science and technology efforts. And while China's rise is a significant example, much of the challenge that we face today has to do with our own ability to create and sustain a domestic national security innovation base. We must address fundamental aspects of our domestic innovation ecosystem by, first, increasing the pipeline of domestic STEM talent, improving and expanding the infrastructure that will keep us competitive in fields like hypersonics, quantum information sciences, and 5G, removing impediments to innovation and speed the adoption of commercial technologies, and creating more opportunities for collaboration and shared experiences between the defense community, policymakers, and private sector technologists. As we build a blueprint for the future of defense, we must ensure that it has been informed by engagement from this one today, with input from industry, academia, and government. We must embrace our role in not only the development of new technologies, but also as the global leader in the responsible use of these capabilities and counter-narrative to China. We must elevate the public conversation surrounding the health of our national security innovation base and what action is required to meet emerging threats and the rise of global competitors. In the end, we must ensure all Americans understand the true cost of inaction. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Jim. Honor to be here with you and the rest of the task force, and it's truly an honor to have our witnesses here today, so I'm pleased to recognize them, and Ms. Flournoy, we'll begin with you with your opening statement.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Moulton and Chairman Banks and all distinguished members of the task force. It is truly an honor to testify before you, and I really applaud this effort to focus on the critical challenge of preparing the Department of Defense and the National Security Innovation Base to meet emerging long-term threats. As has been mentioned, the resurgence of great power competition combined with an unprecedented pace of technological disruption requires the United States to reimagine how we deter and, if necessary, fight and prevail in a future conflict. Central to this challenge is ensuring that the U.S. military retains its operational and technological edge over a revanchist Russia, and particularly a rising China. America's military advantage is rapidly eroding in light of China's and, to a lesser extent, Russia's military modernization efforts. In fact, if we stay the current course, a rising China will likely achieve overmatch in a number of key capability areas, calling into question our ability to credibly deter, defend, and prevail in any future conflict at acceptable levels of cost and risk. At the core of this military challenge is the substantial investment made by China and Russia in so-called anti-access area denial capabilities. These mean that the United States can no longer expect air, space, or maritime superiority early in a conflict. We will need to fight to gain that superiority and then to maintain it in the face of ongoing efforts to disrupt and degrade our battle management networks. Beyond these capabilities, China is investing, as was mentioned, tens of billions of dollars in a directed technology roadmap in key areas from hypersonics to robotics to quantum computing to artificial intelligence and machine learning. Indeed, the primary competition on which the United States must focus, in my view, is the tech race with China. Thanks to Beijing's doctrine of civil-military fusion, in which any commercial or research-based technological advance that has military applications will be shared with the PLA, the Chinese military has made rapid advancements in AI and machine learning in particular. Given the centrality of emerging commercial technologies like AI, quantum computing, 5G, autonomous systems, and robotics, ensuring that the U.S. military keeps its edge means that we have to have our answer to civil-military fusion. I'm not suggesting that we act like the Chinese, but we need to have our own answer, and soon. In addition, both Russia and China have paired these technological investments with doctrinal innovations. Russia is rapidly modernizing its nuclear arsenal to support its escalate to de-escalate doctrine. And with the Trump administration weighing a new START renewal in the wake of our withdrawal from the INF Treaty, I feel that the United States and Russia are on the precipice of an alarming period of strategic instability. Meanwhile, China, for its part, has a theory of victory that's increasingly relying on what they call systems destruction warfare, which is an effort to take out and cripple an adversary's networks at the outset of conflict, deploying sophisticated electronic warfare, counter-space capabilities, cyber capabilities to disrupt our critical C4ISR networks, thwart our power projection, and undermine our national resolve. This means that the United States, again, can no longer take space for granted as an uncontested domain. In the future, space will be a domain through which and from which we project power. Nonetheless, given the reluctance of major powers to enter large-scale conflict with the United States, in the near term, we are much more likely to see Russia and China pose challenges in the gray zone, at the level below conventional armed conflict. We can expect them to focus on trying to unilaterally and incrementally alter the status quo in their favor, using economic, diplomatic, and military coercive means to achieve their objectives. I think the National Defense Strategy of 2018 provides a critical strategic framework for addressing these mounting challenges and reflects a growing sense of urgency among the department's leadership about our eroding military advantage. If you look at the 2020 budget that Congress has supported, you also see bipartisan commitment to ensuring that we invest in the technology and capabilities we need to implement our strategy in the face of a more contested period of great power competition. However, the current budgetary environment, and I think what we can project for the future, will require us to make some difficult trade-offs to buy down risk in the future. The central question for this task force and the committee is how do we invest our defense dollars wisely, and how do we invest with the speed and effectiveness required to keep our edge given the speed with which our potential adversaries are moving. In the near term, I believe the department must make reestablishing credible deterrence our central objective. Again, I don't believe the United States or China or Russia, all nuclear powers, would deliberately start a war given the dire costs involved. We could nevertheless stumble into conflict if an adversary were to miscalculate either our resolve or our capabilities. I think this risk is greatest in the next 10 years when the United States has telegraphed its vision for the future force, but has yet to procure and deploy all of the systems necessary to fully translate that vision into reality. To prevent miscalculation or escalation to conflict with a nuclear-armed rival, I think we have to decide what are the capabilities we need to prioritize developing, acquiring, and demonstrating in order to credibly deter aggression, either through denial of an enemy's objectives or through the ability to impose crushing costs for any act of aggression. And again, I think we need to think in two time frames. First, what do we need in the next 5 to 10 years, which is largely cobbling together current capabilities in new ways, and what do we need 10 years and beyond for a very different future. We need to think creatively about how we can prevent a great power rival from starting down the road to war. This means DoD should devote considerable effort to concept development and wargaming to develop a suite of interim deterrence approaches, again, using existing capabilities in new ways to dissuade aggression. The fact that several countries around the world are questioning the U.S. commitment and resolve means that we also have to do a better job of clarifying our policies about what we will defend and make sure that our words, our messaging, our budgeting all send a consistent message to, again, strengthen deterrence and shape the risk calculus of any nation who would consider using force to pursue their aims. We also need a strategic framework to guide whether and when and how we reveal new capabilities to bolster deterrence and when we keep them in reserve and highly secret. So I'm conscious of time, but I want to highlight 6 areas where I think we need to focus our efforts. First, the DoD needs to implement a series of acquisition, investment, and workforce development reforms to foster the innovation ecosystem that Representative Banks talked about. This is essential to maintaining our military edge. First and foremost, the DoD has not adequately trained or incentivized its acquisition workforce to employ the authorities that Congress has provided them at scale, the more flexible authorities. There are pockets of excellence, like SOCOM and the Air Force, but the bulk of the acquisition corps is not using authorities like OTAs, 804, even SIBRs, and so forth. As we prioritize procuring software and network capabilities to enable the future joint multi-domain operations, we need an acquisition cadre that is trained and rewarded for rapid and agile development of new technologies. Second, we also need top-down leadership to provide strategic direction and top cover to pursuing more ambitious goals. I would love to see the Secretary of Defense set an audacious goal for each of the services to say by the end of the FYDP, we want to see new force units that are focused on human-machine teaming, that are leveraging AI, machine learning, robotics, et cetera. We want to field those, the first of those units by the end of the FIDIP to give the service some very concrete goals to work towards. In addition, various service units like DIU and SOCOM are playing very important tech scouting roles, but there remains what I call the valley of death between having a successful demonstration or prototype and actually getting a spot in the program of record. You know, if you're a small commercial technology company, you often find that valley of death impossible to cross. So we need to accelerate reform efforts to enable that transition. One approach would be for Congress to authorize more flexible bridging funds that services could allocate on a competitive basis to sustain capability development in that period between prototyping and actually getting a spot in the program of record. Happy to talk about that in more detail. The point about tech talent. The department currently lacks the tech talent, senior and junior, civilian, military, active reserve, to develop, integrate, and deploy critical emerging technologies. We need to expand scholarship for service programs beyond cyber to a much broader range of STEM fields. We need to be recruiting mid-career tech talent by expanding fellowships and opportunities for people to come from the tech community into the department to serve, and vice versa. And we need to be doing a lot more upskilling of the current workforce in key technology areas, providing tech talent with viable promotion and career paths in service. Second big basket is the department needs to ramp up its efforts to develop joint and service-specific operational concepts to drive more rapid fielding of game-changing technologies. The United States needs to urgently develop and test joint concepts like multi-domain operations and supporting service concepts. And we need to be testing the technologies that will be most critical to operationalizing these, requiring a continuous reinforcing cycle of wargaming, prototyping, and experimentation. To do so, Congress has to provide the services with more robust funding to field small numbers of emerging capabilities for early stage concept development and experimentation. Right now, we're sort of in a catch-22 position where, you know, the Navy will come and say, I need a handful of undersea unmanned vehicles to experiment with and play with and develop a fleet concept. And the Congress will say, well, no, we can't really give you the money, or certain committees, not this one, will say, you know, we can't really give you the money until you've got all the concept worked out. So you're in a catch-22. They need the technology to develop the concept. If you don't have the concept, you can't get the technology. We need to break that logjam, take a little more risk in the future if we're going to be able to develop new concepts and capabilities fast enough to keep pace with potential rivals. I think we also similarly need robust concept development and wargaming to look at how existing platforms can be used in new ways to shore up key capability gaps. This is exactly the sort of critical bridging work that the Strategic Capabilities Office, or SCO, was doing before it was moved under DARPA. The department needs a SCO-like office to drive these efforts to shore up deterrence and our operational edge in the near to midterm, and I think that its move to DARPA will undermine that capability. Third, the department should adopt best practices and lessons learned from the commercial technology sector about agile development and program management. The department has very ambitious goals to migrate to the cloud, leverage large data sets for artificial intelligence, build interoperable multi-domain networks at scale. The Air Force is moving out smartly and building an advanced battle management system, which is really the long pole in the tent for multi-domain operations. And I've been very impressed with how that effort has been organized. But we need to do a better job of integrating private sector approaches to technology development, data management, network security. And again, we can go into the details of that in Q&A if you're interested. Fourth, I think that budget realities over time will require us to make tough trade-offs between legacy platforms and critical new technologies. Currently, while we've made some progress, I believe the United States is still underinvesting in the new technologies that will ultimately determine our success in the future security environment and overinvesting in legacy platforms. This is a recipe for failure. In order to make the trade-offs necessary, we have to answer a fundamental question for every major program of record. Where is the knee in the curve? Where is the point where it makes more sense to forgo the N+1 platform, aircraft carriers, fighter aircraft, tanks, whatever the major program may be, and instead of taking that one additional platform, take that money and invest it in the capabilities that will make sure that the rest of that fleet is survivable, has the range, it has the relevance, has the combat effectiveness for the future security environment. To me, the SecDef should be asking each service those tough, knee-in-the-curve questions and be willing to make those hard choices to prepare for the future fight. And Congress has to support those hard choices, as hard as those are, because sometimes we're going to have to, decrease or stop buying some legacy systems in order to make the reinvestment we need in the technologies that will make the difference. Fifth, we need to adapt our overseas posture and our security cooperation programs to make them much more effective and leverage the strategic value that our partners and allies bring to the table. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. And finally, I think we need to, again, focus not just on the extreme long term, but also shoring up our capabilities in this critical decade for deterrence. So in summary, and I'm sorry I've gone on so long, but I'm passionate about this issue, we are really at a critical juncture. I call, this is a moonshot moment for the United States. We need national leaders with a vision. We need an urgent call to action. And we need a far more robust and focused investment in the drivers of our competitiveness. That includes research and development with a focus on critical dual-use technologies, STEM education, 21st century infrastructure like 5G, incentives for enhanced collaboration between government, business, and academia. And we didn't coordinate our comments in advance, but many of the things you mentioned. And speed is of the essence here. The actions we take in the next few years could not be more critical. We also need to be, our vision needs to be informed, as you mentioned, Representative Moulton, by our core values and the interests that we seek to protect. I believe the United States must maintain our global leadership role as a force for good, a defender of democracy and human rights and the rules-based international order. We need to make sure that our economy remains the most innovative and dynamic in the world, because that is the foundation of both our global influence and our national security. And we need to be leveraging all national security instruments, not just the military, to achieve the ends we've talked about this morning. So let me stop there and look forward to your questions.
Ms. Flournoy, thank you very much. That was a lot, but we have a lot to discuss here. So we're grateful for your wisdom and insight, as always, before this committee. Senator Talent, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be here and with Secretary Flournoy. And I mean, in all sincerity, I never listened to her without learning something. And we served together on the 2014 QDR. And that was a very instructive process. I, too, want to congratulate the committee chairs, chair and ranking member, for establishing this task force, which in my experience with the committee goes back 25 years, on it part of the time and around it part of the time. I can't think of a precedent like this. I'm still at heart a former member, so from your perspective, what I thought when I heard about it was, oh, great, another committee assignment, right? Because it's not like they're going to let you off the markup or the other things you got to do to serve on this. But I think it's very important. It shows your understanding, as the Secretary was saying, we're now firmly in a new era. We've emerged from the post-Cold War era now into something else, which I think is going to be dominated. I think there's a consensus on this. It's going to be dominated by great power competition. There are, of course, other threats, and you all and the government has to walk and chew gum at the same time, right? And innovation is going to be key to everything. But when you look at great power competition And by the way, we started moving that era in the Obama administration with the pivot, with the rebalance. We see it now with the national security strategy, and I think it's going to continue for many administrations in the future. I think this is generational, which is why the Reagan Institute formed the task force on the National Security Innovation Base, and that's, I'm sure, the reason why you've invited me. I'm co-chairing that with Secretary Work, who knows a lot about the department's approach to innovation. So, and we agree that innovation is going to be the key to the success in the competition. Now, capacity is also important. Numbers matter, and they will continue to matter. And the Chinese understand this also. They recognize the better innovator is likely to win and to have success in that competition. And they are the pacing challenge in the sense that they are the closest to a peer competitor. I think in certain respects they are a peer competitor. In certain respects, they may be outrunning us in this. And also because if we are prepared to deal with the challenge from China, then I think it means we're probably also going to be prepared to deal with competition from Russia and even Iran and the rest of it. Now, I have 4 observations drawn from our experience on the task force. It anticipates some of what we're going to have in our report, which should come out in the next month or so. And by the way, thanks to Mr. Banks and also Mr. Kim and Mr. Gallagher and Ms. Murphy for serving on the task force and contributing to that. So they kind of have a head start on this national security innovation-based stuff. So 4 observations for you all from your side of the table. So as you do this task and approach this task, get clear in your own mind and a common understanding as a group of what the National Security Innovation Base actually is. So we spent a whole session discussing this. And Mr. Kim gave us, I think, the word that you're going to see a lot in our report. It is an ecosystem. It is enormous. It is pulsating. It's chaotic in a lot of respects. It's characterized by dynamism, a very risk-positive culture, and it's changed a lot from the National Security Innovation Base in the Cold War. There are some similarities. The public actors are largely the same. The Department of Defense, the intelligence agencies, the national labs, they're still in the National Security Innovation Base. We still have universities attached to it, but now a huge part of the base, in fact, the dominant with regard to certain technologies, are private sector actors, primarily in the for-profit tech community, who are pursuing dual-use innovation that's of vital importance to the national security of the United States, but who are pursuing it for their own purposes. They're perfectly legitimate, largely commercial purposes. These actors have little or no experience dealing with the government and the culture of the government and the regulations of the government and the procurement processes of the government, and they're often not even aware of the national security implications of their work. So your task is basically, I would approach it this way, it's to coordinate, to direct and empower the National Security Base, Innovation Base, but without suffocating the aspects of the base that are its greatest strengths, right? So I would think about it in terms of defining priorities, structuring incentives so that the various elements of the ecosystem work together towards common goals. In other words, they all see what the common goals are, the incentives are structured so they can do it and even have incentives to do it, and so they're like a team moving towards the same thing. And I think if you do that, we're going to have a tremendous advantage over the Chinese industrial base, which, as Secretary Flournoy was saying, is much more authoritarian, much more top-down, and where they're trying to make it more so with their military-civil fusion process. Now, you're going to have to be proscriptive sometime. You're going to have to be prescriptive sometime. You're going to have to require some things and forbid some things. But I think it will work if the actors in the system at least understand why you're doing that. So they go, well, you know what, we don't like that restraint, but we get it. Okay, we understand why we can't go out and partner on that technology. That's related to the second point. So you're going to encounter, I think, as you approach the national security innovation, you already do all the time in legislation, constant tension between protecting the technology we have and getting the new technology we need, between security on the one hand and innovation on the other, between, if you want to think of it this way, defense, right, and offense. So defense suggests siloed supply chains, which the department's talking about, limiting interactions, export controls. You can't do partnership with certain, the universities or the firms can't do partnership with certain actors. The public actors in the system are comfortable with that because that's the culture they've been living in for a long time. Offense, on the other hand, getting technology requires a degree of transparency. It requires partnerships, consortiums, sharing ideas. Now, there's security. They get that. They all have to keep their patents secure and the rest of it. The private actors are more comfortable with that. So in my written testimony, how do you resolve this? It's going to be a case-by-case thing. We did come across an idea that was suggested by one of our national partners in the National Technology Industrial Base. This new, and you guys expanded this, I think, in the Defense Act last year. It now includes the Australians, the Canadians, as well as the Brits. And we had a briefing session with partners, and they were coming and discussing strengths and weaknesses of sharing technology with the United States. And the Australians made, I thought, a very good suggestion. They said, look, if we were you, we would build higher fences but around fewer things. So decide what the technology is that really is vital, that we do control. Because if they can get it from somebody else anyway, it doesn't make as much sense to restrict our actors, our segments in the ecosystem from partnering, right? And build high fences around that. And otherwise, err more on the side of offense, because I think we're probably going to win this competition more through offense than defense. Whatever you do, be clear about it, because remember, this is a big, pulsating, chaotic ecosystem. They're all going to want to do, and they know they need to do what you insist that they do, but uncertainty from you or the government is the enemy of both security and innovation. Third point, and I'll go briefly through this, because I'm taking too long. I want you guys to be able to get to the questions, but this is, just because I'm brief about it doesn't mean I think it's an unimportant point. Take an inventory of what the department is already doing and pull out the models that are really working for a couple reasons. One, because you may be able to scale and expand them. But the other is because those models will be working for a reason. And if you can figure out why they're working, the characteristics that make them successful, then you can replicate that in other parts of the ecosystem. So I suggest in my testimony, and we're going to focus on this in our report, obviously DIU, which you all deal with all the time, although we do suggest that the investment policies of the Defense Innovation Unit be reoriented a little bit more in the direction of trying to get innovative new tech companies programs of record sooner in the time horizon. Because if the tech investment community believes that by putting money, investing in different tech startups, there's a realistic possibility that they can hit the jackpot with an 8-figure program within a realistic period of time, what we are assured by the venture capital community is they'll all start wanting to go into it, which is, I think, what we want, right? But also look carefully at the Defense Digital Service, if you have not, and at Hackers for Defense. You're nodding heads. I should have known. You're already familiar with this. But I was so excited. I was briefed on both those because those are, one is an inside-out program, the other is an outside-in program. They are organically linking together these two cultures. They are organically drawing bright young tech talent into the national security world. They're changing. It's almost like how joint assignments over time create a jointness. Really look at that and see if you can scale it and expand it. They are expanding anyway. Hackers is expanding. Hackers for Defense, I shouldn't say just Hackers. Hackers for Defense, perfectly legitimate if you're not familiar with it. But they're bringing tech talent into, and by the way, they're helping the department redefine, re-image how it asks questions. Mm-hmm. That's one of the things Hackers, these are teams of kids in universities around the country. They take this course for credit. But they're linked into the national security community, and actual problems are presented to them to solve. And one of the first things they do is work with the government sponsors to ask the questions in different ways, in ways that will make it amenable and open to tech solutions, which is teaching our people in the department how to think in terms of technical solutions. So I was really excited about it. I think you can tell that. Okay, the final point is this. We're all, as Secretary Flournoy said, we need to get breakthroughs in key areas of innovation. AI, directed energy, quantum computing, the list goes on and on. If you want breakthroughs, it means you have to take a gamble on technology, by definition, that isn't already proven, right? Because you're going for breakthroughs, which means you have to make investments that are a little bit riskier than the government is used to making, which means you have to be prepared to fail sometimes. And I think I didn't realize from that side, when I was on that side of the table, what I realize now is how important it is for these actors in the department and all throughout the public segment of the ecosystem to know that you understand that and you will have their backs. They are very afraid of making an investment, particularly if they have to use authorities that go outside the established rules and they don't go through all the regulations and the desks and the rest of it, and it doesn't work. And what will Mr. Smith think of that? What are they going to say? Am I going to get called before them in a hearing? How am I going to explain it? Is it going to be a career ender? Okay? And I think you need to find ways to send the message to them that, look, just as the tech community does, they know that they can't achieve the successes they want with the payoff they want unless they fail sometimes. So I think you need to find a way to send a message. Of course you want the due diligence done. Of course you want thoughtfulness and purposefulness. Of course you want them to keep you informed. You're entitled to oversee what they're doing, okay? But within those limits, it's okay to fail, and as a matter of fact, I think you should send the message that if 5 or 10 years from now, all of their experiments have succeeded, they're probably not experimenting enough.
Yeah.
And if you send that message, then I think, and you do that consistently, then I think there's a greater chance that they will reach out in the way that Secretary Flournoy has suggested. So thank you. Ready to take your questions.
Okay. Thank you both very much. I know we've learned a lot already. Let me dive into questions. Secretary Flournoy, I'll just start with you. You concluded your statement by talking about how fundamentally this is a fight for the survival and success of American values. And that's why it's important to win this fight. One of the things I think we struggle with is the concurrent development of technology and the policy around that technology, the norms of its use, its employment, training, and doctrine or whatnot. In your view, what actions does the department need to take to promote more alignment in policy, employment concepts, training, doctrine, and other matters as technology matures?
You know, I think as we undertake the technology development and conceptual efforts, we need to have a policy conversation that's in each of the key areas that's trying to come up with a set of principles or guidelines that are rooted in our core values and who we are as the United States. I think an example of this is the Defense Innovation Board, which, you know, is a lot of really talented tech people who are working for free, has taken a stab at AI principles to guide our artificial intelligence work in the department. That's the kind of thing, and I think that's a great basis for then to have conversations with the private sector and with the tech providers about what the department is and will do and won't do, and I think it will clear up, frankly, a lot of misconceptions that sometimes exist in the tech workforce. But I think in each of the areas where we're moving out, we should be in parallel having those policy conversations. And I think it's sort of incumbent on the department to sort of initiate those, but also to draw in other members of this innovation ecosystem.
Senator Talon, do you want to add anything to that?
You know, I think one of the things we need to do, and Michelle mentioned this in her testimony, I think you did in your opening statement. One of the things the department has to do, it has to refine its operational concepts first. It has to define how is it going to operate in response to a particular challenger? To reduce it to its essential, okay, how are we going to fight China if we have to fight China? Although I would put it, how are we going to respond to provocations in a way where the department plays its role in a sophisticated cost imposition strategy? Now, when you know what it is you want to do in response to a particular challenge, then you have a more concrete opportunity to consider what are the ethical considerations or the other considerations that are likely to come up in the context of that.
And Senator,
But if you don't know what you're trying to do, it's hard to anticipate what the constraints ought to be in doing it.
Right, Senator, so when you talk about that, are you talking at the strategic level, like how do we go to war with China if it comes to that? Or is it more at the sort of technological level where we talk about the norms for the use of AI?
I think it's both, although I would say on the strategic level, this is a job that is as much or more for you all on your side of the table. In other words, okay, we're in this competition. Let's just pick with a particular actor, with China, since I think it is the pacing challenge. So what does winning the competition look like? What does success mean? Where do we want to be 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years from now? They're defining that. And I think the top-level political authority, which you all represent, what is it you want the outcome of this to be, and why? Now, once you've provided that direction, and I don't think we've done it yet to the department, then they can play their role in saying, hey, what's the national defense strategy in terms of that? I would just suggest, I think success means protecting the American homeland, the territorial integrity of allies, the economy from attacks, and I think it means what Michelle was talking about, the preservation of a system throughout the Indo-Pacific and the world where nations relate to each other according to rules and resolve disputes peacefully and not according to who's bigger. Let me add this because it may be a useful way of thinking, and it's not mine. I was in Tokyo with the China Commission a few years ago talking to a Japanese scholar, and he was referring to Beijing and the rulers of Beijing. He said, you got to understand, he said, we look at the world horizontally and they look at it vertically. We look at it as a world where nations basically have equal rights and operate according to norms. Now, obviously, everybody maneuvers around the edges for advantage. They look at it a world where, and this is an historical view, this is not something recent with the Chinese Communist Party, where they're the Middle Kingdom in a position of suzerainty in essence. And the big dogs get the benefits, and they're the big dogs. And this is the fundamental conflict of vision that I think the Obama administration, I think one of the tremendous gifts the Obama administration gave us was they identified right at the beginning that that was the object of our policy. So once that's set, then we can say to the department, okay, we're going to fight the gray war too within certain limits. How are you going to contribute to that? Mm-hmm. And then what kind of limits do we want to insist upon because of our values?
That's very helpful. Let me just ask one more question. Secretary Flournoy, I started with you. You stated in your testimony that rather than provoke a major confrontation, our adversaries will continue to try to unilaterally and incrementally alter the status quo in their favor, using economic, diplomatic, and military coercion to achieve their objectives. Think Russian information operations in Ukraine and Europe, China's efforts to fortify artificially created islands in the South China Sea. What are some examples of things the department is doing that you see as a, quote, waste of time, money, and resources that could be better used to counter these threats?
Well, this is where, I do think this is why I propose this sort of knee in the curve thinking about major, like how many numbers of legacy platforms, what size, how many, aircraft carriers, JSFs, tank, pick your flavor. Because in addition to the strategic thinking that Senator Talent mentioned, which is absolutely right, I think this body also has to dive into the operational level sort of campaign concepts, because we are equipping ourselves to fight the last war right now. And we're not going to have that luxury. And we have to be thinking, and I want to applaud the department is really thinking through multi-domain operations. The services, the naval services have distributed maritime operations. The Air Force is coming up with its concept, the Army. I mean, I would hope that whether it's this task force or the broader committee is diving into that conceptual work to really understand, because that's the basis on which we should be making the eaches of program decisions. I mean, if I'll give you an example, the long pole in the tent for multi-domain operations is a multi-billion-dollar investment in cloud data infrastructure, networking, interoperability, basically building an advanced battle management system. And that's going to require trade-offs. We're going to have to take money from elsewhere in the program. But if if there's no conceptual grounding for those individual trade-offs, how are you supposed to make those judgments? And so I would really encourage you all to dive into that conceptual work at the sort of campaign level, because I think that is really critical to making the hard choices. And they will be hard choices, because in every case, you're going to be taking a legacy program with a defined and powerful constituency and trying to shift money to something new that has no constituency yet, but without which we will fail. And whether it's failure of deterrence or failure to actually deal with aggression when it occurs. So that's I haven't given you a list of programs but I do think we need to communicate our commitment. What are we committing to defend? And every day, potential rivals need to see us doing freedom of navigation operations, showing up at regional fora, standing behind allies and partners who are taking risk alongside us. And here, I have to say, the recent abandonment of the Kurds in Syria is not only a terrible decision for fighting ISIS, but also sends a horrible message to every partner and ally we have around the world. And that's going to take quite a number of years to overcome, I think, sadly.
I'll address it, and I don't think I addressed the second half of your question, Mr. Chairman, before, so maybe I'll just do it now. So I think the key is to think in terms of how do we impose costs on the competitors in a way that is real to them, so that we have options for deterrence, but in a way that is not escalatory, at least in a military sense. What are our horizontal options? Now, some of those, and we have to begin thinking more consistently in terms of the fact that this competition is across a number of domains, obviously, and they all have to work together. So there's economic, there's reputational. You've done that with the BUILD Act. I was so encouraged when I saw that, because that's an opportunity for us to put some money in, for example, in Southeast Asia, which Beijing views as its sphere of influence, and that's going to set alarm bells off in Beijing. What are the Americans doing in Southeast Asia and in South Asia? See, that's a way of imposing costs on them. So the curious thing, Mr. Chairman, is that I think some of this can be expressed in low-end options. We're here talking about technology that could be very helpful in the short 5 to 10 year windows that Michelle was talking about. I'll just throw out an idea, okay? Russia, very interested in the Arctic. China is very interested in the Arctic. We could present a real alternative as competitors to them in the Arctic if we had more icebreakers. And if the Coast Guard had more of those cutters. I think you're buying 3 of them, they want 6. So these are low-end options. But why don't we get involved in areas they think are very important? Make them think. See, that's a cost imposition thing. Really what you're doing here, there is a similarity to the Cold War. It is not a Cold War. But just as in the 45-55 timeframe, Congress created, on a bipartisan basis, an architecture of national security tools, which was then used by presidents of both parties to prosecute the Cold War, that's what you're doing now. You're doing it with the CFIUS reform, you're doing it with the BUILD Act, you're doing it with the RIA, and you're going to do it with procurement. That's the question you're asking. So I think in terms of, if you were down there at the White House and at the end of the table, and Michelle's been in those rooms, making decisions, what options would you like to have? And this was the problem with air-sea battle. And I said at the time, wait a minute, if our option in dealing with the Chinese is to bomb the Chinese homeland, and I know that's oversimplistic, but what president's going to order that? because they've taken the second Thomas Shoal.
Right. Senator, thank you very much. I mean, I know we're running over here on time, and we're grateful.
Missouri,
I want to defer to not the
I was going to say, in
ranking-
Missouri, we would say that I gave you more answer than you gave me questions, so I'm sorry about that.
So I'm happy to turn over not to the ranking member, but to my co-chairman. This is a very bipartisan task force. And with that, Mr. Banks.
Thank you, Chairman Moulton. Ms. Flournoy, in your testimony, you highlighted Beijing's doctrine of civil-military fusion. While here in the U.S., there seems to be a growing rift between commercial technology hubs and the Pentagon. What additional efforts can be undertaken to help create a model of civil-military fusion domestically?
I think that, in my current capacity in consulting, I'm actually finding there are a lot of folks in the tech community, whether it's Silicon Valley or Austin or 128 or wherever the hub is, who actually want to contribute to the national security space. And so we have to make it easier for them to do that. And I think it's a matter of systematically sort of identifying the key barriers, whether they're acquisition barriers, whether they're tech talent barriers. That we need to, I listed a number of them in my statement, and you listed a number of them in your opening statement, but I think we need to systematically break down those barriers to allow them to contribute more. I do think that one of the ways to really incent the commercial tech ecosystem is to put to help them, companies cross this valley of death. Right now, the narrative in Silicon Valley is, we had an AI company, it had a couple of cyber contracts with a service. We really bet on this turning into something. The service loved the technology, and then it got canceled because the service didn't have the cloud infrastructure and the data architecture to then take it to the next level as a program of record. Or we have an AI-enabled quadcopter company. They've won all of the SOCOM and SoftWorks and all of the prototyping contests and demonstrations, and that was in FY19, and we're going to put them in the program of record in 2021. And their investors are like, what happened? We need $10 to $20 million to survive to get to 2021. What happens in 2020? And there's literally no color of money that can help them in that bridge. So I think that bridging work. I think the tech scouting is working. The demonstration prototyping is working. That bridge to the program of record and putting real money on the table, that is what is going to get the venture capital community excited. Because right now, most of them, with a few exceptions, are advising companies don't develop a national security business because it's too uncertain, the risks are too high, we won't get the return on investment, you're wasting your time. You're just going to suffer a horrible, flame out after a few years of effort. So we have to change that incentive structure. And I do think there are ways that you could provide some more flexible bridging funding that companies can compete for to get some of them to program of record. And once they're at scale, they will come. If you build it, they will come. But you have to get them you have to put some successes on the board.
Thank you. Senator Talent, in your testimony, you mentioned the need for the DoD to move toward a different procurement strategy and allow for additional risk. Over the past year, China has made significant strides in the development and testing of hypersonic weapons. How has China been able to develop those technologies at such a fast rate?
That's a good question. I am concerned that this is real and that the latest developments are reflective of what's actually happening and that they may be well ahead of us. They have been putting a consistent emphasis on hypersonics for a long time. I think part of it is the fact that they are very comfortable with a missile-centric military, and this was a logical development. When I was in the Senate, I was trying to get the department to focus. I put money in for that. It was difficult. This was in the mid-aughts. difficult to get them to focus, and the Chinese were working on it. I think this is a result of effort over time. I think generally speaking, they are better at incremental innovation than at breakthrough, and I think it's because their system is such a top-down system, it doesn't encourage it. I would also not be surprised to find out that they stole a lot of the foundational technology. And one of the things you have to keep in mind, particularly with this aspect, with this competitor, is that they're very good at that, and they build it into their plans. Okay, so specifically with respect to hypersonics, that's what I would say. That is one of the vital technologies where I think funding is still basically dominated by government money, which is unusual, like compared to AI or quantum. So I think the department can do a lot about this, but it's really important because the impact in the next 8 to 10 years, particularly in that theater, if they are able, I don't have to tell you all, to operationalize hypersonics, we have trouble because our missile defenses go out the window. So that's what I would say specifically with regard to that.
Ms. Flournoy, any thoughts on that, or what are the barriers that are preventing the United States from catching up?
Again, I think that our efforts on hypersonics have been primarily sort of programs through DARPA in the past. Those have not generally, led to programs of record. I do think, consistent focus on this will change that outcome. And there's some amazing innovation happening. I mean, one of the companies that I recently visited is 3D printing 80% of hypersonic engines, which will dramatically reduce from design to production to like 15 months. It's amazing. But so we're starting to get traction in really interesting areas, but we, as the senator said, we're just playing catch up.
Yeah.
Well, thank you to both of you. I believe you have done very well to set the stage for what we're trying to accomplish through this task force. With that, Chairman Moulton, I yield back.
Thanks, Jim. I'd now like to turn to Congresswoman Slotkin, who has spent a lot of time leading from inside the Department of Defense before coming to be a leader in Congress.
Great to be in front of both of you. Sorry, I have a cold. I apologize. And especially Ms. Flournoy is the person who brought me over to the Pentagon. It's great to see you. Couldn't agree with more on, in particular, how much we are sort of on our heels when it comes to bringing in defense innovation and the speed, bridging the gap between concept and actual program of record. But I actually think, personally, there's a group of us who think it goes deeper than that we just don't have a doctrine of innovation at the department. We don't have a sort of theory of how we bring new innovation in. And you talked about how you need to see top-down leadership in order to get people to take risks, get people to use the authorities Congress has given them. Can you tell me, can you flesh that out a little bit? If a new Secretary of Defense came in and said, I really want to try and deal with this problem, that we're not taking advantage and bringing in, new innovation, how would you specifically help filter that down to the depths of our acquisition officers?
Yeah, I think there is a leadership component, but I think the best way to change behavior is through training and incentivizing your human capital differently. Right now, as the senator described, people are terrified of failure in the acquisition, in any aspect of the acquisition system. You need to change the incentive to say, yeah, we want you to deliver major programs of record on time and in schedule and cost, but when it's come to agile development of new technologies where we're experimenting and getting feedback from operators and then, failing and then learning and then doing better the next time, and it's this iterative process, you have to have a tolerance for failure. That means looking at how you reward and promote people. It means training them in a very different approach. Agile development is totally different than the traditional DoD 5000 approach to acquisition. And I'll give you an example of something great. Secretary Hanno Gertz, who's the acquisition executive in the Navy, this year the Navy's acquisition award went to someone who presided over a tech failure, but learned. And that learning is what created the success for the Navy. And so he wanted to hold this guy up and say, this is the new poster child. This is someone who took risk. By taking risk, you know, we failed, we learned, and now we're on the path to success much faster than we would have been had he been risk averse. So that's the kind of thing, but it takes training people differently. It means rewarding them differently. It may even mean that you need a separate subcadre of acquisition professionals that are trained and incented differently than the rest. And it means the human capital piece, we have got to get more tech-savvy talent coming in and out of the department at all levels, civilian and military, because, you know, it's a totally different skill set that requires a different approach. And, you know, so I would focus less on a doctrine and more on looking at the human capital piece and that training and incentive structure to get the change in behavior that you're looking for.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that. I'll just offer two things. One, an inside-out feature, the other, an outside-in feature. So we need to reform the Pentagon personnel system in general. I did a project with Leon Panetta and Jim Jones a couple years ago, but it's absolutely crucial in this area, particularly hiring, retention, et cetera. And I'm thinking areas, cyber command, space command, high-tech areas. We cannot use a system that was designed to produce, you know, to get people in at age 19 and produce fighter pilots and ship captains. It works for that. It does not work for cyber and technology. And I think to the extent that we can just insist to the chiefs, make it a priority. I mean, SecDef just says, look, I want to see at the end of this year that you are using the authorities Congress has given you. And if you need more authorities, ask for them. And you are bringing people into these tech, whether it's procurement or whatever, and you're hiring them directly out of Silicon Valley on a specialized 2-year package where they come in as a captain or whatever it takes. I want you to recruit talent that way. And then the outside-in feature is this, and it's actually probably more hopeful. I do get a sense after looking at this that if we can do the bridge funding right, the procurement right, get the incentives right for the tech community so they see opportunities here. And I think a good deal of patriotism will go with this. If you look at the Hackers for Defense, these kids are excited by the prospect of standing up for human rights and peace and, you know, and the norm-based system and the rest of it. But anyway, if you can get them to think of this as something they want to do, it's a business problem they need to solve to accomplish their objectives. I think from the outside in, they will find ways around the Pentagon culture and rules. And if you talk to the digital defense service people, that's one of the things they do. When they describe how they hire people in, who's the fellow who runs that? He briefed us. Yeah. And he said, we got out the book on the Pentagon personnel hiring system, and we figured out all kinds of workarounds. There's stupid rules and the rest of it. So we were able to get people in the short term. So I would really have him in here and talk to him about how he did it.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the medical doctor on the task force. You know, there are a lot of places where we're facing competition from around the globe, but one place where people still come from all over to get American care is in our medical system. Our healthcare system is far from perfect, but in terms of technological innovation, it remains unrivaled as a world leader, and so we're delighted to have Congressman Desjarlais's perspective on this task force. Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'm not going to ask any medical questions today. Yeah.
We might ask you some. I mean,
okay, that's
how's your
fine,
back,
yeah.
Michelle?
I'd just like to quantify things a little bit. You know, the whole purpose of this task force, see where we're going to be and where we need to be. And I don't know if you can answer this question or not, but maybe try and play with me. You know, we consider ourselves the greatest fighting force on Earth, and I think that's probably true. But, you know, we're here today because we have concerns of peer adversaries who are catching up. If you could, assuming that the United States is a 10 when it comes to overall military, where was China and where was Russia 10 years ago, and where are they now on that scale?
Yeah, that's a tough one. You know, I think let's start with, you know, I think overall as a military, there's still no comparison between the Russian military and the U.S. military, but they have pockets of excellence where they've invested. They've invested in nuclear forces. They've invested in cyber. They've invested in space. They've invested in little green men and irregular forces that can do things like the operation in Ukraine. You know, it would not be a fair fight if we ever got into something with them, but they're very, very good in this anti-excess air denial capability in terms of what they've set up in and around Europe. And so we want to make sure that we would do even better. You know, I think that in a conflict, that if they crossed a NATO border, we had a war with Russia, NATO would prevail, but it would be more costly today than it should be because we haven't made the necessary investments to counter their A2AD capabilities. With regard to China, same thing. I mean, the military overall, you know, whether it's human capital, whether it's training, whether it's operational experience, it's nothing like the U.S. military, but that's not the point. I mean, they're taking an asymmetric approach, and the question is not so much, you know, in a conventional fight, how would they compare? It's more, have they invested enough and made enough progress in key asymmetric areas that they can actually undermine our strengths and they can exploit our weaknesses and prevent us from being successful in even getting to the region and being able to operate effectively in the region. So I think you have to look less at a sort of direct apples to apples comparison and more of an asymmetric and counter kind of evaluation.
Yeah. Their militaries are adapted to their strategy better than ours is, in part because they were rising powers, revanchist powers, and they looked at what we did in the early 90s, and they had problems they had to solve if they were going to exercise influence. So and they have adapted their military to those purposes. So anti-access area denial, et cetera. They're at the tasks and the missions that are most relevant to their regions of the world, they have armed forces that are suited to that, okay? Now, when you get beyond that, expeditionary, that sort of thing, there's no comparison that we're superior. But we have not. Look, I think there was, and I was here and in the Senate for a long period of this time. You know, we were distracted by other things. We were also the top dogs. We just didn't really think. And for a long time in the department, the assumption was that nobody would be able to challenge the United States for decades, right? And we weren't really thinking about it. I do think as regards the Chinese, something, I'm also on the China Commission, and we studied this, so something that's actually quite relevant to our consideration. I've reached the conclusion that Beijing really, really is concerned about the operational capabilities of the PLA. They have all this shiny new equipment and the rest of it, but they are very concerned about their ability to execute in a mission, and that's important. So I would just say, again, it comes back to operational concepts and the rest of it. We got to think in terms of how do we impose costs that are effective and real, short of escalating conflict, because if the answer to something they're doing in the South China Sea, building an island, is to escalate it up, we're not going to do it, and they know we're not going to do it.
Okay. Well, I'm about out of time, but thanks for the answers. I asked the question because we have challenges within our own defense budget. We spend way more than other countries combined, as has been pointed out again and again. And maybe a question for another time is, how do we approach the Pentagon to reprioritize that budget that we have to work with? If it's 710 or 750 billion, what do we get rid of, and what do we change to change the culture that we need to be where our adversaries want to be in 10 years, where we are now and where we'll be then? So thank you for the answers.
Scott, thank you very much. So we now turn to Congressman Mitchell. One of the emergent themes from the early discussions of this task force, without question, is the integration of the private sector into what the Department of Defense is doing. And Congressman Mitchell brings tremendous experience from the private sector, and we're delighted to have your perspective on the committee.
Thanks, it's very kind of you. Let me start. I think one of the mistakes, and your feedback would be useful, one of the mistakes in our thinking in this nation is we separate out military power from national power. China in particular, but Russia's evolved, especially with Putin. The national power is linked to all their capabilities, and they intertwine them. somehow we think we have this distinct little military world, and then our economic activities, there's some overlap, but and I think we're losing the point. So my question is how do we get that point across, not only just Congress, but to the general public, that national power is in part based upon our economy, our educational system, as well as on the application of that in our military systems.
Yep. No, it's such an important point, and we've talked a lot about the military because this is a task force of the House Armed Services Committee. But when I'm out in public talking about this, and people say, "Well, what do we do about China?" I said the first thing we should do is invest in the drivers of our own competitiveness. And yes, the military is on the list, but it's not. It's research and development. It is STEM education. It is 5G and 21st century infrastructure. It is cutting-edge technologies. It is smart immigration policy that attracts and tries to keep the best tech talent in the world here in the United States, which is what our history has been. So it's all of those things. And then, yes, we also have to talk about how does the military contribute to deterrence and shaping the calculus of countries so that they don't commit aggression and all of that. But it is, first and foremost, investing in those other areas. And, oh, by the way, investing in our diplomatic instruments, our ability to, offer a counterpoint to the One Belt, One Road through maybe we need a digital infrastructure fund or what have you to offer, other countries more open, transparent societies and so forth. So anyway, but I totally agree with your point.
Well, let me comment for both of you and Senator, your feedback. I think I agree with you. Our decision-making processes on Syria leave a lot to be desired. I don't think it sends a proper message to the world. And frankly, canceling the summit in Copenhagen was not a great idea. That, in fact, one of the topics for that meeting was, in fact, investment in the Arctic, Northern joint investment with Denmark and other countries, not just militarily, but other investment, and canceling that it was a destructive act as well, in my opinion. But we'll see how we can get that back on track. Question, how is it that what's your idea in terms of co-investment with venture capital? You talked about it as well, getting venture capital involved. Rather than simply a bridge fund, which is just send money, do you have any recommendations on how we encourage that co-investment between the government and venture capital, private equity, in technologies for that mutual joint use? Sandy, you want to start this time? All right, whoever.
I mean, there have been some, In-Q-Tel is probably the best example of early stage co-investment, and it's sort of, it's basically a good housekeeping seal of approval that, the intelligence community is interested in this company and this technology, and that tends to attract outside investment to support it. But I really don't think that, I think better than co-investment, frankly, they need the market opportunity. It's much more powerful for DoD to say, we're going to spend $10 billion on AI technologies over the next 5 years, and to put out that target and that, kind of commitment. And we're going to hold a series of competitive contract requests for proposals and other things to build an ecosystem around defense AI applications. That would move the needle far more for venture capitalists who are advising their companies on whether to pursue national security business or not than, a $10 million co-investment in a given company on AI. That's my view.
I agree with that. Can I just make a couple of brief comments in response to your first question?
Absolutely, sir.
I could not agree more with what Michelle was saying about we need a whole-of-government approach to these competitions. Part of what you are doing and need to do is to strengthen the civilian elements of national influence. And I think somebody at some point needs to make a deal with the State Department, which is, look, we're going to increase your funding. We're going to give you more authorities. You have got to become more like the Department of Defense in terms of planning and how we need them to play a stronger role. Now, a lot of that is not their fault. They don't have the funding, the training, the rest of it. But I want to see that happen with the State Department. I've talked with former Sec States about this, and they all want to do it. The only other comment I would make is this. I completely agree. A lot of this competition is going to be prosecuted, and the primary tools we should want to use are the civilian tools of national influence. But the foundation of those tools is and will remain the United States' ability to deter kinetic aggression, okay? And one of my big concerns is, if we start winning the competition on other fronts, reputationally, economically, and otherwise, these authoritarian regimes are fully capable of expressing their ambitions and responding through aggression if that avenue is left open to them. As a matter of fact, that's a classic tactic, is to direct dissent and outward by starting something with your neighbors. So we can't, the hard power tool is and will remain the foundation of the
Let me pose a quick question, if I can, Mr. Moulton, then it won't be for this. You both had comments about investing in legacy technology. This is not the right environment to have that conversation, but I agree with you. But the question then gets down to our specific recommendations of what it is we delay investment or consider not and invest elsewhere. Because I agree with the discussion. It's easier to make that kind of general comment, but then in a classified environment to talk about where do we start on that, and it's not going to make a variety of people happy, but that's part of why we have this group.
Just make a 10-second conceptual answer, which is for me, what's been helpful is this knee in the curve idea, which is, if you took the money for the N+1 platform of whatever that type is, and you folded it into, this is, okay, it's going to be operating in a more contested environment, so I'm going to put money into the defenses of that system. I'm going to put money into buying back that system's range and ability to reach out and touch a much more protected adversary. I'm going to make sure it's cyber secure. I'm going to make sure it can leverage and plug into an interoperable network. So I think it's really it's not worth buying that additional platform, but to take that money to make all of the other platforms in that class more survivable, more effective, more relevant.
That's my question for you, is which ones? Where do we start?
Okay, yes, we can follow up on that. Yeah.
Same question.
Thank you very much. So we now turn to the first Green Beret in Congress, Congressman Michael Walz. I spent quite a good deal of time working on the ground in Iraq with Green Berets, and I always found them generally quite talented and capable and smart and all the above, so I'm not quite sure what took so long, but we're delighted to have you here, Mike.
I have a side mission to make De Oppresso Liber as popular as Semper Fi, but I got a long way to go, man. So just two quick comments, and first of all, it's great to see you again, Michelle, and good to meet you, Senator. Two quick comments on some of the things that you've talked about. So I also sit on the Science and Technology Committee, and yes, we need to invest in foundational research, R&D, all of those pieces, but it's much broader than defense investment, and we need to relook at how the Chinese are taking advantage of what I think is our greatest strength, which is the openness of our educational system. But for example, if you receive a grant from the National Science Foundation and come up with some amazing research, statutorily you have to make that publicly available. And so what I don't want to see, or what we're looking at on the other committee, is how do we maintain that openness, but then also protect it? Because I'd hate to see all of these taxpayer investment just for it to continue to be stolen, whether it's Confucius Institutes or in a number of other ways. So that's one, and then two, Senator, I do think we have a fantastic bridge in place in terms of personnel reform, where you're looking to bring in folks from Silicon Valley, give them a few years, or bring in specific types of talent, and it's called the National Guard and the Reserve. And I don't think we use them and think about them nearly as effectively. I mean, you have to think about, I had a master sergeant who is a fantastic weapons guy, but he was also a vice president for Verizon's cell phone network. Where is he better used? But when I asked the Guard, can you tell me how many people you have working in Silicon Valley? That's just not how they're organized. They're organized to be a supplement for a brigade combat team. So looking at ways that we can really, I think those bridges are in place. You could take a cyber expert that is learning the latest and greatest and put them on orders for a year or two to infuse that back in. So I would just encourage, as you both engage, to think about that as well, whether it's stability operations, cyberspace, election security. Who's in all 9,000 counties in the United States? The Guard. It's really our only national entity. Question for you, because I was reading through your trade-off component, and it's similar to my colleague, who I think I'm still trying to convince not to retire, who I think is fantastic. I'm really interested in what we don't do. What do we give up in terms of platforms and missions? I think the existential question for this committee is, how do we deal with extremism, China, Russia, rogue states overlaid with $23 trillion in debt? There at some point has to be trade-offs. So what systems more specifically would you advise that we give up to invest elsewhere?
Well, let me start by directing you to, if you have, I'm sure you have, but I would just take a second reading of the new commandant's statements. He's basically presented this framework for the Marine Corps to say, look, the things that have been the metrics by which we measured our power in the past, how, amphibious shipping, large deck, et cetera, that's not necessarily what's going to determine whether we win in the future. I have a new concept of distributed maritime operations. There's lots of things I need to invest in to make the Marine Corps able to really support the broader Navy in sea control and this much different kind of way of operating in a contested environment. And so, watch this space. You should expect that I'm going to make some trade-offs in traditional platform buys in order to invest in a whole lot of new technology areas. So of all of the chiefs, I think he has been the most explicit on how he's starting to frame those trade-offs. MCCITIC has done, the Marine Corps Combat Development Command down in Quantico has done really cutting-edge work conceptually to kind of try to frame this so that individual tech and program decisions have a conceptual basis for being made. So I do think that's probably the most forward-leaning example, but all of the services are busy trying to get it exactly this point. And, sorry.
I think it's a great example of, just in the interest of time, of kind of taking on what we've talked about in terms of sacred cows. But I would love, either for the record or in a follow-on session, as you look at the new NDS, and then you look at where we're actually spending, what is outside of that scope? Where are we basically spending on what I call, great traditions that we often find in the services, whether it's static line airborne operations Incheon style amphibious landings or the 12 carrier fleet. What conceptually are you seeing that falls outside of that framework, and we're doing it just because?
I'd be happy to come back and talk to you individually or for the task force.
The one other question I was going to ask was actually about the Commandant's new guidance, so we're in good shape there. Thank you.
Marines can be forward-thinking, too.
Every once in a while. Well, thank you all very much. This has been fantastic, and we've covered a lot of ground. I'll give the two witnesses an opportunity to provide any closing remarks, if you have any, and then we'll conclude the hearing.
Just to say thank you for the work you're doing. I think this is one of the most important things that the HASC and the Congress in general is doing. It's so important that we get this right and get it right quickly. And just to say, I'm happy to support your work in any way that I can in a follow-on way. I'll also just flag that we are currently involved in specifically on a project on this human capital question on tech talent. Happy to share those results with you when we get there.
Great, thank you, Secretary.
I just want to repeat, I was greatly encouraged to see the formation of this task force. I cannot think in 25 years of when the committee's done something like this, and its existence is sending the right signal to the department. In fact, I don't know if you probably have the same experience. I've had a number of people, not from inside the government, but people call me when you put the hearing notice out because I was testifying, to urge me to talk about this or that or the other thing, and to say how excited they were that you all are here. And so I'm grateful that you're doing it. And if we can help in any way, either one of us, I'm sure, let us know.
Well, thank you. I'm confident we'll take you both up on those offers. We are excited as well, but we have an awful lot of work ahead of us in a mere 6 months, and we look forward to being in touch. With that, this concludes the hearing. Thank you all very much.